Hi, I'm Stacy Ramsey. I'm here at Realty Connect USA, Team Musso. I'm with top industry leader Rich Klein with Diamond Law Group, Paul Musso, and Peter Musso. We're here to talk about the legal aspect of buying and selling a home to better inform our customers, clients, and followers. Rich, do you want to talk a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I started in the industry in 2002, which is somehow 20 plus years ago, when I first started working with the Musso team. Paul.
It's amazing how time does fly. Yeah, 20 years.
20 years.
20 years.
Yep.
It's I love saying this story. So when we were at a small office in West Islip, and you were making your rounds when you were first starting in the business, you showed up in your Toyota Celica, literally 20 years ago, and I'm not gonna say what you drive now, but it's amazing. 20 years of
Yeah, so it's funny story about that car. So that car and I, it was one of these things where like, I didn't even know what an oil change was. I never changed the brakes, I didn't change the wipers. And I used to drive back and forth to college in Albany, and it just lasted forever. And that car and I, I had some good memories. And then as I became an attorney, not that I think that your car necessarily dictates your success, but there was one agent that will probably watch this, and she'll call me out on it, that literally we were walking out, and I got in my car, and she called me afterwards. She's like, you got to get a new car. And I was like, I get it. But, that car and I, yeah.
Now you drive a very sexy car.
Yeah.
And the only attorney I can tell you that I could reach at that time, it was probably 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. There's no attorney out there that I could ever reach at 5 o'clock in the morning, and that's what made me stay attached to you.
He's firing off emails at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning now.
Yeah, when I interviewed my partner, John, he came in for 3 a.m. And he's like, is this some type of test to see if I could be up this early? And he shows up at 3 a.m. and we go through our interview. And he didn't really have any, perspective of what it is that I was doing every day, working minimum 12 hours a day, right? Mm-hmm. And then as he started getting into it and now is, pretty successful, he's like, now I understand why you had to do it, because you didn't have any time during the day.
Right.
I mean, we're talking the days 20 years ago where you couldn't even email from your phone. You couldn't take pictures from your phone. Right. So you had to be in the office to answer to the emails. There was no cloud-based system you could work with. There was no working from home. You had to do everything in the office.
Great point.
So
right.
I had to fax things.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't have a fax machine in my house.
A lot of people here probably won't even know what a fax machine is.
Yeah, exactly. Short for facsimile. There you go.
Did you go to Albany Law or SUNY Albany?
I went to SUNY Albany for undergrad, and then went to here on Long Island. I went to Toro.
When did you graduate?
2002.
Okay, so I graduated. I went to Albany too. I never knew this.
Yeah.
So I graduated. I went 02 to 06.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was leaving. I passed the torch to you.
That's fun. Yeah.
But when I went, it was the #1 party school in the nation twice.
Well, and
it was actually worse the years in between, because we tried to get it back and then we did. So it was just not really,
They stopped Fountain Day after.
After me.
We got to enjoy it. Yeah.
They still have kegs and eggs, I bet.
They did. I don't know if they still do it today. But.
There's a plug for SUNY Albany school system right here.
That's funny.
All right.
So give us a little bit about history of you, your company.
Yeah, sure. So at the Diamond Law Group, the way I try to explain what it is we do is I didn't create real estate. Real estate's been around before I started, and it'll continue to be here after I retire. But in general, there is a real estate process. And then there's our process, and then it's applying our process to the real estate process on behalf of our clients. And it's a certain manner of systems of follow-up with a proactive communication touch. Because at least back in the day, I'd have one agent call me and say, did you send the contract? And I'd say, yeah, I did. And then the other agent would call me and say, did you do it? And I'd say, yeah, I did. Then I'd have the loan officer say, where's the contract? And it was just way too much communication, all asking the same question. So right now, I know my staff, because it's a little bit after 9 o'clock when we're filming this, has already touched base with every single client we have, depending on the type of transaction. So things that are more of a priority are things that are not in contract, and then ones that are closing. And then everything in contract we follow up with once a week, depending on what we need to on the file. So that's the way in which we operate. I personally can't stand the answer of when a client calls their attorney and the attorney responds back, I don't know, let me find out. It's like, why don't you know? So we try to be proactive and tell people what they need to know before they even need to know it. So that way They're not frustrated with the system, and God forbid they go online and search Google, because we do things drastically different here in New York, and especially on Long Island. So to tell people what they need to know before they need to know it is just a little bit of communication. And when you research our firm, which I think a lot of people do online nowadays for most things, when you check the reviews, the number one review, because it has like the highlights of the words, it says communication. And like our number one compliments, we communicate. And like, I think to myself, I think I mentioned this the other day, Peter, that communication should be the part of every job.
Right.
Right? If there's going to be a delay with your food, the waiter or the host or hostess should come out and say, like, there's a little bit of a delay. Right. If you have to raise your hand in a restaurant and say, like, where's our food? You're already shot. So communication should be part of every single job. And the fact that people notice it and compliment us on it means a lot to me, because we pride ourselves on it, and I'm not waking up at 3 a.m. just to do nothing, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, like, communication is pretty paramount, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and you guys do it really. I mean, we've been around for a while and have done work with obviously many attorneys. And that's why we love working with you guys, because it's like you said, we get started, and by 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, we have an updates on our files.
Yeah, sure. And it works both ways. Because keep in mind, I rely a lot upon future referrals based upon past clients, but not only clients, but agents as well, right? Because for me to advertise to an individual buyer or seller is very difficult, right? For you folks, I'd rather advertise to you, because this is what you do. So when I get a sales agreement or an offer from you folks, it's no questions. Like, you have everything, the surveys, the COs, the home inspection's been negotiated. So when we get it, it's like, all right, we know what we're getting from Team Musso, and then we just send the contract, and like, we're good. Whereas that's not always the case. So we have to do a little bit more to get answers, and then the buyers and sellers think that one another with the same set of circumstances, like they're playing games. The buyer thinks the seller's having their open house, they want other offers, and the seller's saying, I have other offers that I'm not accepting because of them. Why didn't they sign? Meanwhile, the seller's attorney didn't draft the contract, and they didn't draft the contract because the agent didn't send over everything they need. So it's kind of like there's this miscommunication, which actually makes things worse. Yeah. So, for sure.
That's
A
interesting.
lot that goes into it, and some things we don't even think about, but there's a lot that goes into it.
Right, right.
Yeah, we try and tell, unless you're in this business every day, like, it's hard to believe from the time you submit an offer how fast the transaction actually goes. So when we deal with a customer, like, we try and proactively set the expectation for them. It's like, once you have an offer submitted and you have a home inspection done, we expect contracts to go out within 24 to 48 hours. And if it doesn't, like you said, everyone has their hands up saying what's going on.
happening?
The question,
Sure.
right? The question of the process.
Right.
Yep.
And today, majority of contracts are pretty, I don't call them boilerplated, but most residential single-family home contracts.
So, one of the questions that we're going to cover today is what advice would I have for buyers and sellers, right? So, for me, when I lecture on these various topics of real estate in front of real estate agents, because we're accredited to give continuing education, one of the things we mention is communication. So if you call an attorney's office to get more information about it, how soon do they call you back? That's one of the first things. And then when they call you back, there's questions you should ask. It's not just how much do you charge, which is another topic we'll go over today.
Right.
But when you're asking when you're asking the attorney questions, you shouldn't just ask like normal questions, what do you charge? And I'll elaborate on that in a minute. For me, it's how long, attorney, do you think it should take to get into contract? And I'll ask you guys, how long do you think it'll take to get into contract if you call up the average attorney on Long Island? What would your answer be?
Average attorney?
Yeah, average attorney, go ahead.
A week?
A week.
Maybe a week and a half.
Yeah,
A week and a half, okay.
Week and a half.
I was thinking a
So
week.
this is the equivalent of asking your waiter how long should it take for the food to come out, and them telling you 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Okay? Because when you want to eat, you walk into the restaurant, you're already hungry. Nobody goes to the restaurant and you're like, oh, I'm going to get an appetite when I order the food. No, you're hungry. That's why you're there, right?
Right.
So if you ask the average client, when do you want to be in contract? What's their answer?
Right.
Immediately.
Yesterday,
So you have misaligned expectations. If somebody wants to do this today, and they're being told by their attorney a week and a half, but they're being told in a week and a half because that's the attorney and they know what they're doing. But they don't realize that how long should it take, right? So how long should it take to get into contract? So
24 to 48 hours.
So to Paul's point, 24 to 48 hours, here's you pull back the curtain behind the scenes, you have a chef's table in the restaurant, this is what happens, okay? We have an interactive website, so it's if I use Musso Team and I have the same lender and I have the same attorney and I have the same title company, it's data entry points. I press generate contract. If you don't have that sophistication, okay, which we developed again 20 years ago, then it's just the same boilerplate form. For anyone who's listening to this, you could literally Google Long Island residential 1 to 4 family home contract, and everybody's going to come up with the same contract. It's 28 paragraphs. Starts with paragraph 1, it's the property, like it's the same contract. It's
Okay,
not
that's interesting.
ratifying the Constitution.
Right.
Right. We don't need the Democrats and the Republicans to somehow agree to this. Right. So you have a normal contract. It's a non-adversarial proceeding. The seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to buy, and yet these two parties who are represented by two separate attorneys are wanting to do the same thing. But sometimes attorneys get involved and they like to fight about things. So we send the contract over to the buyer's attorney, okay? It's taken me 30 seconds to draft it. I used to fax it, now we email it, fine. How long, if you're the buyer's attorney and you're in a vacuum and there's nothing else going on in your life and you're not interrupted, how long do you think it takes the buyer's attorney to review that contract?
Couple minutes.
A couple minutes, but how long will they tell you it takes?
A couple of days.
A couple of days.
Right,
So
right.
instantly the compounding effect of a couple of days, if it takes them a couple of days to review it, then of course they're going to have questions, and then you send that to another attorney who's going to take another couple of days to get answers.
Right.
But in reality, this could be done in
Hours.
an hour,
Yeah.
okay, 1 hour. So right now, when we're scaling this out from a week and a half, and we're wondering why, behind the scenes it could take an hour to review the contract. Really, it should take 2 seconds. Because it's the same, there's only so many ways you could take advantage of somebody else if they didn't know what they were doing. And it's very easy to figure these things out if you know what you're looking at. So then the buyer's attorney discusses it with the seller's attorney, and let's presume there's no real major issues because it's the same contract. The buyer's attorney then needs to meet with their client, the buyer. How long do you think this conversation could be, even if you had the most nitpicky buyers who ask a lot of questions? How long do you think that process could possibly take?
Well, it takes an hour.
An hour, right? It takes another hour, maybe, right?
case, yeah.
And pre-COVID, we used to meet with every client. Post-COVID, it's Zoom, teleconference, or sometimes it's such a rush the clients sign because they trust us, right? Okay, so far we're up to 2 hours. Then they need to DocuSign, which takes oh so long, and wire the money. And even if they've never done this before, you can go to the bank and it takes like maybe another hour. So we're up to 3 hours. If the buyer's attorney was proactive and said, hey, my client's signing today and wiring you the money, be on the lookout. Here's the contract, can you have your client sign while you wait for the down payment? If I then, as the seller's attorney, receive the DocuSign contract and then meet with my client sellers, they've done this before. Usually sellers have less questions because they've done it before,
Right.
presumably, hopefully with me. The only complication is if they're also purchasing, because that takes a little bit of finessing to understand the logistics of. So I meet with my client, maybe it takes another hour. That's 4 hours, right? So with respect, every personal property or investment property that I've ever purchased, I was in contract in like 2 hours, right? And that's because I just know how to do this. And when you're an attorney being interviewed by a client who's never done this before, and your expectation, just like the restaurant, is you want to eat now, and you're being told you're going to eat in 2 hours, if that's what it is, that's what it is. And you're just there, so you just deal with it.
Right.
But when you're speaking with an attorney, and their answer for me, and I go over this with clients, is I can get you in contract today. It's subject to everybody else doing what they need to do. So I will push them. That's why we send the proactive emails, and then we'll blind carbon copy you on them so that way you know we're doing it. And then we also have this thing called snoozing, where when we send the email at the morning, because we can't call that early, it repopulates in our inbox at 1 p.m. and then we call. Because the last thing we want is our clients calling us saying, hey, why don't you call the attorney? I'm like, oh, you know what, why didn't I think of that? Because not everyone communicates at the same level. Text, call, email, whatever the case may be. So then we call at 1. If we can't reach them, we say, hey, we just spoke with your paralegal, here's their name. So that way they can't disclaim that they spoke with us. And they said you're in court and you're gonna get back to me at 3 o'clock. And if that's what the next metric is, then we follow up at 3 o'clock. Hey, didn't hear from you, 3 o'clock. Right. So that way there's a track record. Besides the fact the listing agent may have their own offer, right, or another offer, and they want to do that one, and it's like, no, we copy the other agent on everything, so that way everyone knows that the ball's not in our court. Never want the ball to be in your court. We're ready to proceed. We want to sign, but we don't have the contract, or your attorney hasn't signed. Right. So that's the first question, having to do with time. Second question, somewhat related, is how long should a closing take? Right? So if I asked you folks, how long should a closing take, what would your answer be?
An hour.
An hour.
Another reason
Right.
why we love working with you, because
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
tied up in a closing
this is-
3 hours.
Right.
No, it's like they come prepared to the closing. Everything.
Yeah,
ready to
so
go.
part of what happens is, not to get too long-winded into this, but sometimes attorneys are too busy, or they don't pay enough attention to what they're supposed to, and they do their job at the closing table,
Right.
which is like the chef buying the eggs to cook your sandwich. Now it's like, do that on your own time, right? When you see attorneys cutting checks, the sales attorneys cutting checks, sometimes I have sales attorneys asking for transfer documents to be drafted by the title company. It's like literally day 101 as a summer intern, you draft transfer documents in my office. That's what you learn. And yet the attorney who has been doing this for longer than I've been alive shows up like without these documents. I'm like, well, how could this possibly be? And then you wonder why you're there for 3 hours. It's because everyone's doing their job on your time,
Right.
or not prioritizing things in a more efficient manner.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
So
You think about everything that goes into the closing, and as I'm 20, and I say this all the time, I'm 20 years in the business, and I still learn. Sitting here, I'm still learning, so thank you. Because as I think about things, and because there are attorneys out there that we know that are not proactive, and you just gave me some ideas to make sure I can get them to be proactive. Because at the end of the day, we've been through this numerous times, sitting at a closing, and sometimes we've been in dry closings, right? And I mean, that's no fun. So to be at a closing for 2-3 hours, especially today, is almost like is
yeah, it's totally disrespectful of everyone else.
Yes.
Besides the fact that I said this to my clients yesterday, I know the closing's going to happen, right? It's like I love analogies because I think we learn through stories, right?
Right.
So when you get up in the air on a plane and the pilot's like, look, there's going to be a little bit of turbulence, I'm okay with that relatively. I prefer there to be no turbulence, right? But as long as the pilot who's on there, reasonably sound mind, which I presume he or she is, and they tell you it's going to be turbulence, when you get to the turbulence, you're okay with it.
Right.
Because you know your life's not in danger and eventually we're going to land, right?
Right.
And when you go to the closing table, clients don't know. They don't know.
right.
They don't know if it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, that's a major inconvenience. They took off work, they planned their movers, they're having a paint party on Friday.
Right.
It's a lot. They have their kids being watched,
Yeah.
they have a certified check, and they're ready to literally move on with their life, and then they suddenly can't. And the reasons why they can't are just totally avoidable.
Just somebody to do their job.
It's usually what it comes down to. Yeah.
We talk about it all the time. It's, how do we create efficiencies? You mentioned like we send you a deal package. There's no reason why when we send you a package on a client, we should have to have multiple conversations afterwards, unless it's something out of the norm, right? You should
Sure.
have everything you need to do what you got to do to draft a contract and get it going.
Yeah, I mean, so put it in perspective, to circle back to, interviewing an attorney, if you're speaking to different attorneys and one of them tells you it's going to take you a week and a half to get into the contract and the closing's going to take 3 hours, but I charge X, and I'm going to tell you I can get you a contract in a day if everyone does what they're supposed to do, and I'm going to make sure that they do,
Right.
and the closing should take a half an hour. And I guarantee you that if I go over everything I need to on a buyer side, let's say, which is infinitely more than the seller side, at least in terms of signing, I'm going to go through everything I need to, and you're going to retain more of it, and they're going to go through less and retain none of it.
Right.
So how are these two things happening at the same time? So if you want me, and I may charge Y, which may be more marginally than X, this is the value. And you have to understand the value, because one of the other questions for today is what should the client expect to pay in general, let alone for an attorney, right?
Right, right. Generally at a closing.
At a closing, right? So for me, when clients say, number one question, it's usually the only question, what's your fee? Your fee determines your cost, right? It doesn't determine your value.
Right.
And you could always find somebody to do it cheaper.
Sure.
Like, what is this? The price is right? Hi client, I will do this for $1 less than any other quote that you get, right? And then somebody else says, I could do it for $2 cheaper. Like, what are we doing here? This is what I charge, and this is what you get for that. Anything less than that, you get less. So if and when there's issues and you're sitting there wondering why, it's because you skimped on an attorney, right? For the biggest investment of your life.
Right.
It's kind of like not a great look for me. So in terms of other closing costs, I love this question as well, because out of everything we said, that's just like the precursor to an actual conversation. This is just ways in which I can explain to clients what they get when they retain an attorney, a real estate attorney in particular. The number one thing that I explain to clients that they have no perspective on are closing costs. So it is an absolutely insane phenomenon that parents who have been through this experience in the 80s, 90s, whatever the case may be, routinely tell their children, bring your checkbook to closing because there may be surprise fees. That's like an insane statement to me. They put the price of bacon at a diner because if you order a bacon cheeseburger and they didn't tell you that the bacon costs 99 cents more, people will lose their minds over it. Understandably so, because it should have been something that should have been disclosed up front. But meanwhile, you just made an offer on $1 million house. You're speaking to me, asking about closing costs, or in particular, my fee. For my fee, I will tell you what closing costs are in advance. Because if I don't, and I'll ask you guys here, when do clients, buyers in particular, find out about their closing costs, like in close proximity to the closing? So if you're closing on Friday, when do you think the clients will find out what their closing costs are?
What time are they closing?
Yeah, right. Good answer.
What time
Yeah,
are
let's say
they
they're closing noon on Friday.
That's when they find out.
Yeah, which is like an insane, insane statement. So in reality, most buyers find out their closing costs the day of or the day before.
Okay.
But when do you think clients want or need to know this information, especially if they need to move money around? Immediately.
Right. Okay.
So they made an offer. They're savvy, intelligent, thrifty individuals who are making an offer on $1 million house, and they have no idea what it's going to cost. That's insane. Okay, so I will go over your closing costs. For the buyer, it's usually more speculative, right? For the seller, it's pretty static. It's commissions, the real estate attorney, the transfer tax. So the very short version for Long Island transfer tax is just take the purchase price and divide by 250, right? It's actually, for every $500, they charge a $2 fee, but if you divide that math real quick, just take the purchase price. On Long Island, the city's totally different, and divide by 250. That's what sellers could expect to pay. So they're only paying the transfer tax, their commissions, the seller's attorney's fee. There'll be minor adjustments for taxes and oil, but that's not really anything to speak of. And so it's readily identifiable for a seller prior to. Buyers, on the other hand, is totally different. Okay? So there's a couple of different categories of closing costs. However, they're all derived from 8 different variables, okay, that kind of filter into all of those boxes. So the easiest way to explain this is your lender, the borrower's lender, it needs an actual contract to apply for the loan. So anything prior to that is either pre-commitment or pre-approval. If you have a pre-commitment, it's only subject to a contract, which is what we're saying now, appraisal, which could be waived, and title, okay, which we're going to receive anyway. So from the buyer's end of this, they're going to receive a loan estimate at the very beginning, but that's just a quote, and it could be totally off, and that's still okay, as far as lender compliance, which is an insane statement that I'll elaborate on in a minute, okay? But the closing costs for the buyer at closing is disclosed on a document called the closing disclosure. And the lender sends that out 3 business days prior to closing. However, it's not necessarily accurate, okay? Because it's a nationwide form, and as I said before, closing costs and everything else in general on Long Island are totally different than the rest of the country. So outside of New York, you could have one individual or one company that's the bank attorney, the agent, the attorney, right? Everything could be one person who handles it for everybody. They could represent the bank, the buyer, the seller, and everybody's by one single person. So on the closing disclosure, the closing costs aren't broken down how they are in New York. So it'll say, bank fees, but then they could actually put a title fee in there because in New York, that's how we handle it. So you can't go by on the closing disclosure, it's not going to say title, it's not going to say bank, and it's not going to say seller. There's going to be literally 8 different categories based upon their type that don't necessarily match up with it in New York. So the problem is when you have a client who doesn't do this every day, they're being told one thing from their bank and they're being told one thing from me as their attorney. And the two things may not align, which is confusing and frustrating for clients.
You're saying it's pretty common or common enough that CD that gets circulated is not accurate.
There's only one single bank that requires it to be accurate on Long Island. Every other time, if it is accurate, that's just coincidence.
It's a general form that, like you said, the banking industry has to send out 3 days prior.
Yeah, so I'll elaborate on the number one reason why clients are surprised at closings in just one second. So when I speak with clients, I tell them, I will tell you what all of your closing costs are, and I guarantee you I will be correct, okay? And here's the closing cost. These magical things that nobody could figure out beforehand. First, purchase price. This is real complicated stuff so far. Loan amount, okay? It's like, we know these things up front, but yet at the same time, they're being told to the clients the day before closing. The non-exempt taxes. So we don't, if you're, God bless the seller who's a wounded combat veteran who pays no tax, as they should not. You, as a normal person, let's say you're not a senior, right? And you don't have all these other exemptions. So you just have a normal star exemption. We need to base your taxes that you will pay based upon that, because you're not going to be entitled to the seller's exemptions, right? So it's the non-exempt taxes. The day of the month is super important. Today, we're filming this, happens to be the 31st day of the month, right?
Right.
Closing costs are cheaper today,
Okay.
which I'll elaborate on in a minute. But your payment is that much closer, and I promise I'll get into that. The month of the year, which is actually the most tricky part. So again, we have purchase price, loan amount, the tax is not exempt, the day of the month of the year, okay? Which county you're in is super important as well, because Nassau and Suffolk do things drastically different when they're both complicated, yet they're not the same, all right? Then you have if the house is heated by oil or gas, or propane. You know, you go out Fire Island or on the East End, a lot of the houses in North Fork, for that matter, are heated by propane, which is not included with the sale of the home. And then any type of insurances, right? If it's flood insurance, that could be assumed, and that's also relative. And just to elaborate, also, as part of the loan amount, you also need to know the interest rate. So all of those factors will factor into what your actual closing costs are. And I guarantee you that it will not be higher than that. It cannot possibly be. When parents say, bring your checkbook for surprise fees, you remember, I know it's going to be a dated reference, but remember that Hawaiian Punch guy who just used to jump through the wall? Like, is that what we expect to happen at the closing?
Right.
Like, when somebody's like, wait a second, I have a surprise fee. I'm like, your dad told you about this, take out your checkbook. Like, what surprise fees based upon what we just went over? These are readily ascertainable figures beforehand. We know them before you make your offer. I can tell you everything that it's going to be, except the banks don't do this for two reasons. One, they're not necessarily obligated to, because they can't actually do so through a legitimate loan estimate that gets acknowledged by the borrower until you're in contract, which again is circular in its logic for New York. In the rest of the country, it's not. But in New York, if you're in contract and then they tell you what your closing costs are, if you don't like them, what are you doing? This is the same thing with the waiter example of him walking over, or she's walking over like, hey, that bacon was 99 cents. Like, I already ate it. What do you want me to do about it? And they're like, well, if you don't like it, too bad, you got to pay. Right? And then dad comes out and they're like, you gotta pay, I told you, gotta pay. But in any event, second reason why they don't do so is until you know that you're actually retained as the agent or the attorney or the lender, you don't, right? So what ends up happening is the bank, through no fault of their own, puts sometimes the lowest amount allowed by law, okay? Where in actuality, depending on the day of the month or the month of the year that you close, it could be two totally different numbers. So without that explanation, you look at the closing cost and it tells you $2,000, but it could be $10,000. So here's a real quick example as to why, okay? So let's presume we're in October, just because it fits my fact pattern well. And we're in Suffolk County, which we happen to be in, okay? Happy Halloween. So what ends up happening is we're in October. Your first mortgage payment, if you close in the month of October, October's interest will be collected at the time of closing, okay? So if it's October 1st, you're collecting 30 days of interest. Then the month of November goes by, and your interest for November is due December 1st. So from October 1st to December 1st is 2 full months, but you're prepaying one of them at closing. So if your interest is $100 a day, your closing costs are $3,000 more. With me so far?
Yeah. If
you close October 31st, your payment would still be December 1st, but it would be 31 days away. So you'd only pay $100. So 100 from 3,000, what you disclosed, you're up by $3,000 in essence, okay? So that's one disclosure, and that's known as interim interest. But wait, it gets worse. In October, in Suffolk County, the first tax payment would be 12/1, okay? So in October, we don't even know what that tax is going to be. In fact, 12/1 is when the tax is due, but routinely it doesn't come out until mid-December, around Christmas time, which is great. And there's actually a grace period through January 10th, okay? But because the tax payment is due the same day as the first mortgage payment, it needs to be collected at closing. So that's 6 months. Plus, we don't know what it is, so the title companies traditionally gross that up by 20%. So I just say 1 extra month, it's easier to figure out. So up to 7 months right there, okay? Now, if we close October 1st, the seller would have prepaid the taxes from October and November. So you have to reimburse them 2 months. So the 7 that we had to the title company and the 2 that we paid to the seller were up to 9 months. But the bank needs a couple of bucks in their escrow account, and they'll routinely collect 2 months. So the 7 plus the 2 is up to 9, plus another 2, you're up to 11 months. And just for simplicity's sake, because again, I'm an English major, if it's $12,000 a month, divided by 12 months, it's just $1,000 a month. So if I'm telling you, Rich Klein, at the beginning, during our initial consult, when you just asked me what my legal fee is, and I'm telling you the closing costs are $11,000, and you're checking with your lender, and their minimum is 2, you're up by $9,000, plus the $3,000 I said for the interim interest, you're up by $12,000.
Right.
So, and the disclaimer that the bank and the attorneys will give at the closing, when the borrower will legitimately say to their lender, like, why did you tell me 2 when it ended up being 12? And they'll say, well, if you have to pay the seller for any taxes you prepaid, that's not a bank cost. I don't have any RESPA obligation to you. And you had to pay the title company 6 months. That's not going to the bank. It's not a bank fee, which is why it's confusing when you get the closing disclosure and it says bank fees. Well, yeah, the bank escrow is one thing, but the title company is collecting other money, and it's in totally different sections. So the closing disclosure, for me, it does serve 3 important purposes if we're being really thorough. 1, it's your accountant needs it, okay, post-closing, to establish your basis in the property and get any write-offs. 2 is to avoid any surprises at closing, right? So major surprises. So if it says 30,000, you have to come up with 32. Okay, for most people that's like an okay margin of error. Okay, and then 3, there is a section where they compare the loan estimate to the final, and it should be within a certain percentage. There's actually a 10% variance that is acceptable by law. They call it a cure. So if closing costs are up by 10%, the bank actually has to pay for it. So for me, that's the one single purpose, is to avoid surprises. Your accountant needs it, and we need to compare. It's relatively what you were told at the beginning compared to now. The problem is that the comparison of closing costs of what they actually are compared to what the bank thinks they are, the bank has a different definition. And what I tell clients is my definition of a closing cost is money coming out of your pocket at closing. Doesn't matter who it goes to. If it's money that you had that you need to give to somebody at closing to purchase the home, that's a closing cost.
Right, that's all the buyer's going to care about.
Right. So again, we start off with a simple thing like, what do I do? And then like, what do I charge? There's more that goes into it. I can't just be like, well, I'm $17.49 and 99 cents because I know somebody else is going to charge you $17.50. From like a mental thing, like, oh, he's cheaper, right? From a cheapness perspective, like you can look up in a thesaurus and be like, I refer to somebody as cheap. It's like, that's never a good thing. Like, oh, that Rich Klein, you got to use Rich Klein Diamond Law Group. There, he's cheap.
Right. Yeah.
It's not what you want.
It's not what you want.
No.
How about value? Like, he explained to me what my closing costs were to avoid any surprises. And for me, I was going to say for my money, pun intended, but clients do things in groups, right? Remember when you got out of college, everyone got a job?
Yes.
Then everyone got married in theory, right? Then everyone had a kid. Then you bought a house. Like then everyone retires. Like everyone speaks to people at this, like in the same age group, right? And all it takes is for 3 people to be at a dinner table, where one person loved their agent and attorney because everything was told to them up front. And the other person's like, that's a totally different experience than I had. Right. And they wonder why. It's because of the team that you've surrounded yourself with. That's really all this comes down to, right? You may not like what I have to say about closing costs because they are expensive. But I think that most people would rather know ahead of time, before making an offer, than the alternative when it's just being rationalized, and it's still perpetuated to this day. I hear it all the time, once a week at least, where people are like, oh yeah, I guess I should break out the checkbook. This is more than I thought it would be, and I guess this is part of the experience. Like, it doesn't need to be.
So you see it happen. It's happening on a regular
all the time.
basis at the closing. Yeah.
Yeah. This is what I'm going over is the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
This is just the way it is handled in the industry, and people, if everyone does the same thing, then everyone's kind of okay with it.
Right.
So it's unfortunate, but that's the way it goes. One of the things that I lecture on is why do closings take 3 hours, right? Why is it that there's one pizza place, of which there's a million of them where I'm from, Massapequa, that's thriving, and there's a line out the door, and there's another one that goes out of business? It's the same ingredients. Why is one more popular than the other? Why is one closing 30 minutes and the other is 3 hours? It's not just random choice. So I view real estate, remember that game Mad Libs? We enter in a noun and an adjective and a verb, and then you read the sentence, and it was like so funny because nothing made sense. Well, guess what? When you apply that to real estate, and I know who the agent is, who the attorney is, who the lender is, I can pretty much guess how this transaction is going to go. It's readily ascertainable and very predictable. I love being wrong.
Right, yeah.
I call my partner John. I'm like, closing only took 2 hours. I thought it was going to take 3.
Yeah.
You know, like I've had attorneys in these offices like, I think I broke my record. It was an hour and a half. I'm like, I could have done 3 closings by now.
So for us to ask if we're repping the seller and we want to get a jump on things without stepping on your toes, is it wrong for us to ask for any of those docs?
You mean the documents beforehand representing the seller? That speeds things up for sure.
But when we're repping the seller and the buyer has to come to the table, like the closing docs, like you legally as the seller's attorney don't have a right to have those docs, or you do?
In advance, you mean?
Yeah.
No, not really.
Okay.
So like this closing that I had, yeah, go ahead.
Is it wrong to ask for them? Is it wrong to have the conversation? I'm asking.
I mean, with the buyer's attorney in advance to make sure that they're there like on time and review everything? Not really. This closing that I had Monday of this week, I get there early. My clients are there early. Other side, the attorney, who I know, from years of practice, looks at me. She's like, "This is not going to be an easy closing." I was like, "Oh God." Now I thought it was going to be the bank attorney. The bank attorney for a Monday closing, their office is in Locust Valley, and we're closing in Valley Stream, okay, which is not exactly close to one another. They're there on time with certified funds. So that's usually a concern, is that the buyer's money that they're borrowing was sent from some West Coast bank to here, and they're not even awake yet. So it's going to take some time to hit. Then the bank attorney needs to go to the bank, and not every person who attends the closings authorizes them the account. It becomes like a delay. That was my concern. Besides the fact that there's something known as funding approval, where the buyers has to sign everything, everything, like literally everything, and then send it to the bank so that way they could review every T and I, right? Everyone's there. So then it gets to be on time for closing, buyer's not there. I'm like, okay, well, they're coming from Brooklyn, maybe they're a little late. 20 minutes into the closing, they show up, okay? No apology, no nothing. So routinely what happens first at the closing is the title closer will ask for the driver's licenses because they're notarizing the signature, and just as a matter of course, they'll ask for the check, the certified check. So they asked this buyer for the check. He's like, "I don't have the check." I'm like, okay, why not? So I take my clients out of the room because this is not a conversation that we need them to be a participant in. Let the other attorney figure it out, and then she'll report back to me. Now, the other attorney already gave me a heads up that this would be difficult, right? So this is just par for the course. So then he's signing everything, reviewing everything, which you have a right to do. But this closing could have been done in half an hour. Now, it's 2 important points regarding this. First of all, he had to sign everything, and then part of the funding approval was that he needed to send in a copy of what they refer to as the cash to close. So then he needs to go to the bank, which thankfully was Chase, which is around the block. If it was some other bank that was only in Brooklyn, like, we're not closing that day. Like, my clients legitimately they just emailed me this morning. They were flying to California at 5 o'clock, right? So like they need to close. So in any event, what should have been a half an hour closing ended up being like a 2 or 3 hour closing, because then when he got back, then we needed to, we didn't need to wait for funding approval, but then he still had to finish up a couple of things to sign. In any event, that was 100% avoidable. So I love analogies, if you couldn't already tell, or stories for that matter. Like, if you've never been to a Starbucks before, but you've heard a lot about them and you want to try it out, when you get up to the barista, you're not like, where are these beans from? And you're like, Colombia. You're like, how long did you grind them for? You're like, 2 minutes. Like, how long did you brew it for? It's like 4 minutes. It's like, we can't go through this right now because there's 80 other people. So if you want to conduct a certain level of due diligence, that is your right. But the closing itself is not necessarily that time. If you have questions, you're entitled to it, and I don't want to discourage anyone from asking questions. But at the same time, when you're at the closing table, you have to sign everything. You can't change any of it. Otherwise, we're not closing. So if I've had a client that wants to review everything, that is their right. And I actually encourage that. That's why I have an interactive website for communication and transparency, so you can see everything online. But you can't ask all of those things at the closing. It's just a complete waste of everyone's time. So again, last story, and then we'll move on, is I have 3 kids. I was there when they were all born. When I walked in there, I wasn't like, excuse me, like, what are you doing? right? And how much of this and what time is this? Like all these other things. It's like the baby is coming.
Right.
The closing is happening.
Right.
We don't have time to sit here and ask what every little beep and whistle is. This is occurring right now. And if you had questions, that's great. You've had 9 months to ask all those questions. Do it beforehand.
Yeah.
Like this is happening right now. No one has time to answer all these questions right now. So that's why a closing could potentially take long. There's also another reason, while we're discussing it now, is avoidable walkthrough issues. Very commonly, we'll get, it'll be just from a geographical standpoint. Closing is at 10. It's in Bayshore, okay? The property is in, Massapequa. These are like 45 minutes apart. So if the closing is a half an hour before the walkthrough, math is not on our side that you're going to show up on time. So scheduling your walkthrough in advance, especially if there's possible issues, for instance, pre-negotiated home inspection issues that the seller has agreed to repair when you have zero confidence that they're actually going to make those repairs. Keep in mind, guys, for the real estate agents that may be watching this, if there's no other agent on the other side, this is free advertising for your buyer. And their lasting moment when you're getting ready to take your Instagram picture with your key is they just fought for an hour about a $500 repair, and everyone's tensions and the relationship is frayed. So when they leave and they're like, would you use that agent from this company? Like, no, it was a terrible experience. Why? Because the seller didn't make repairs? That's a fair validation of your services because your client didn't do something? But no, this is how clients remember the experience, which people are super important
It's the
into.
experience. In a situation like that, because we've been through it numerous times, so let's say you're closing on a Tuesday, is there any objection of going to the walkthrough? Because I like to do pre-walkthroughs.
We push it all the time.
So we do a pre-walkthrough when there's multiple things going on. We'll do a pre-walkthrough, like if closing on Tuesday, I'll be there on Sunday or Monday to make sure all that shit's done, all that stuff's done, and then
You can bleep it out on the other.
and then do the walkthrough. So, so those are things.
Yeah. So, guys, when I lecture on these various topics, you speak with your clients, I speak with your clients, but real estate attorneys and real estate agents don't necessarily communicate with each other about what our clients are saying to us individually.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So when I try to add value, as you're referring me, so me adding value for you folks, one simple thing I suggest is not even pre-inspections or pre-walkthroughs. It's once you have the appraisal done and there's no title issues, the deal's locked in. We have a commitment, we have the appraisal, we have title, we're good. Sometimes it's just a waiting game as to when we could schedule.
Right.
Call up your clients and be like, hey, you want to go to the house? Right? What does it take out of your day? Time? Okay? You don't think your clients want and need to go to that house? They're probably sitting there as we say this right now. They're parked right in front of it.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And how many times do you, if you ask your clients, at the end of the closing, how many times did you go to the property? How many times do you think they do? Once? Twice? 3 times if they're lucky?
Right.
Spending $1 million on this thing, and they're looking on the internet for every single picture that could exist,
Yeah.
right? Doing all this research. You don't think by you calling them, say, hey, you want to go to the house? Right? But when you're there on a secret mission. If the seller has some stuff that they need to get out and it's still not done, you got to let people know. You can't just show up at the closing.
Prompts a conversation.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that you have a list of the home inspection stuff, which you know because you helped negotiate it, and you're looking around and you're like, this outlet's still out. Are you going to do something about this? Oh yeah, I'll get to it. No, they're not. Okay?
Right.
And then we can get an estimate ahead of time, right? Because every estimate they have, what is our client going to interpret that? It's not enough. And then we send in ours and it's not good enough. Because then at the closing table, if we don't have that, what do? Right? You start at 1,000, I start at 0. You start at 900, I start at 100. And then, there's that expression that if both parties are upset at the end of a negotiation that it was successful, that's actually a crazy thing to say. I did my job, everyone hated it. But that's what happens, guys. There's a mental hurdle if I say 1,000 that you don't want to go over $500 because you feel like they won. Oh, they got 600? No. But meanwhile, the $1,000 is just some fabricated number that somebody felt good to say.
Right.
It's like a game of chicken. I don't want to negotiate against myself. So when we're sitting here, never too busy for your referrals. Well, you're a little too busy because you didn't go to the house a week beforehand, and this person was a hoarder, and they agreed to all this stuff. They didn't do anything.
Yeah.
So you want me to refer you? It's how about you figure that stuff out? So pre-inspections, pre-walkthroughs are super important, for sure.
Good stuff.
So back to the contract, it's been signed. Can anyone back out?
So great question, Stacy. So this is the number one question that I don't like answering. The reason is that when clients come to me, it's for protection of their legal rights. However, I have to disclose and disclaim to them that anyone can do anything they want at any time, right? I had clients who were purchasing in Long Beach, Sandy happened, and they were like, I'm never gonna do this ever again. And I need you to get me out of the contract. I'm like, well, the contract doesn't say if a superstorm hits Long Island and causes mass devastation that you can cancel the contract. It says you have to proceed. It actually does say if there's catastrophic loss, you can cancel, but catastrophic loss is also in the eye of the beholder. Right? In any event, buyers can back out at any time, sellers can back out at any time. Anyone can do anything they want. The contract itself and my whole occupation is based upon good faith being entered into by both sides. If you both want to close, where there's a will, there's a way.
Right.
There may be bumps along the road, but like we'll figure that out because both parties want or need that to happen. If one party, like most recently I had a nice little old lady who wanted to or needed to sell her home and move down with her family down south, right? And she just couldn't find anything to buy. So she's like, I need to back out of this contract. And the buyers were like, well, you can't. She's like, well, I am. And for me, it's time and money, okay?
Right.
So in paragraph 23 of the contract, for the buyers, it says that if the seller decides not to sell, you have to sue what's known for specific performance because there's only one of this property. I don't care if it's a condominium with 100 units, none of those units are the same. It's the same thing with identical twins. They may look and everything else the same, but they're not really perfectly the same. Same thing with real estate, there's only one of them, and you're suing for this specific one. And a judge or jury, if it gets to that point, which it probably won't, would decide on it. The flip side of that, for the sellers, if the buyer decides to back out, it's the down payment as liquidated damages because damages would be difficult to ascertain. So you're agreeing up front what the damages would be, right? So you could say like, oh, market value went down and it cost me this, and none of that matters. It's the down payment that is the damages for the seller if the buyer decides to back out. Now, how does this really work? The example that I give my clients is that the contract is very similar to a speed limit sign. Now, I took 495 today, right? So what's the speed limit sign on 495? 55 miles per hour, okay? If you drive 55 miles per hour on 495, that is dangerously slow. Like, you're gonna kill somebody driving that slow, okay? So everyone does whatever they want. You're like, well, if the speed limit sign's there and I can do what I want, why bother having the speed limit sign? That's a valid question. Why bother signing the contract if anyone can do whatever they want? And the answer is you need to take the contract, just like you take the speed limit sign, and you need to take somebody to court, right? What happens when you get to court, very similar to the speeding limit, is the cop has me on video going 120 miles per hour. Am I going to be convicted of going 120 miles per hour? No. I'll just negotiate that down to something else, right? It's the same thing with the contract. It's very rare, if ever, that in my 20 plus years of practice, that a client has literally said, I need to keep all of their down payment.
Okay.
It's a negotiation, right? During COVID, people were scared to leave their house. And they're like, I'm not selling my house. It doesn't matter to me. Sue me, right? As the expression goes. And then it's just a reimbursement. All right, you spent money on the appraisal, your attorney, whatever, like here's your money. Because the likelihood of the buyer actually suing requires three things, all of which are unlikely to happen, okay? The first is time. Pre-COVID, any litigation took minimum 1 year. And that's not 1 year to be decided, that's 1 year to like get it going, okay? So 1 year. And during that interim, the seller can't sell the home because the buyer will put what's known as a lis pendens, which is a notification of a lawsuit, for which no title company can insure, because the title company's job is to literally ensure that there's no litigation, except the lis pendens says, red flag, there's litigation. And the buyer, for the most part, put down a down payment. Do buyers have multiple sources of money for the down payment? No, usually it's a large percentage of their assets that they put down, and they don't have another down payment to use for another property. Especially because, as we'll get to in a minute, the judge or jury may decide that you actually have to purchase the home, or you're going to lose your down payment. So if you decide, if it goes that way, like, oh no, I changed my mind, I'll buy the house. Like, you already bought another house. Like, what are you doing here? Right. So time is the first instance, which most people don't have. Because when you're purchasing a home, usually you need to purchase a home. Right. Second thing is money, right? So to retain an attorney for this purpose, attorneys not that they don't want to lose, but they don't want to waste your time and money, right? So if it's not a great case, they may charge more to rationalize how much more difficult it's going to be for them to have to actually win. So just to paint very broad strokes, because I don't do this every day, you're probably looking at 10 grand. So 10 grand to do this, you have to really not like the other person, because traditionally that money is like non-refundable, okay? As a retainer. The third thing is likelihood of success. So I view litigation as a coin toss. You could be 100% right and still lose, right? In any argument that you've ever been in ever, have you ever been wrong? I personally have never been wrong, right? That's the way it goes. Because I believe in whatever I'm saying. Why would I say it if I didn't believe in it? So everyone, when you go to court, you don't think that they know that they're right, and they always come up with an excuse as to why, the judge didn't take this into consideration. It's like, you lost. You lost. The Bills should have crossed on the conversion at midfield with the 4th and 1, but they didn't. They lost. And you could have every other camera, and it's like, you lost. You lost. And that's a lot of time and money to spend just because you have a vendetta against somebody, right? So just literally move on with your life. It didn't work out this way. Everything happens for a reason. It sucks, and it's not easy for me to say, but the contract isn't really worth that much if the parties aren't willing to honor their obligations. And that's why we have not closed until we have closed. I have heard and seen things that you wouldn't believe, where clients, just normal people, same circumstances, totally different interpretations of context as to what's happening here. I had a client very recently. We closed one day later than we should, and she completely lost her mind over it. And what am I supposed to say? It's only a day, but for her it was a big deal with all of the things going on in her life and how this, disadvantaged her. So then we started asking them for money, and for reimbursing her for all of these other expenses. And now all we're doing is talking about fighting as opposed to talking about closing. And the likelihood of us actually getting something, unless seller's really willing to sue her, I just won't sell in the house if we don't close by January 31st. It's like, okay. And we did, because she was like, I just won't do it. And we had to close that day, and we closed that day, and it was extremely, difficult for the buyers to do whatever it is, but that's what they signed the contract for. But, it's not a perfect science, there's no guarantees, and until you've closed, you actually haven't closed. So the short answer is, what happens after you sign a contract is, if the parties enter into it with good faith and perform as they should, then we're happy. Right. If they're not, then it's either you litigate or you try to collect some type of money for damages to settle the dispute.
That makes sense. All right, so can you give us the best advice for buyers and sellers?
So for individuals, usually it's first-time home buyers that skew on the younger sale demographically, or older folks who are selling their homes. That's just the way that it works. The best thing that can be done, and my advice for all clients, is you need to start consulting with your attorney immediately, right?
Yes.
So if you're going to start your business, you don't start your business and then consult with your accountant, right?
Correct.
You should start with your attorney immediately, because there's a lot of information that I need to go over with them, namely the closing costs, the procedure, right? What it is that they should expect, right, to be in contract, then the in contract with title and mortgage, then the closing, what they should sign, closing costs, etc. It takes time to do all of that. And if they're in their driveway, having just completed the home inspection, and they're only calling me because the agent asked them who their attorney was, so that way they could sign contracts before the end of the day, their sole question is, what do you charge? And I'm like, give me 15, 20 minutes to go over everything that we go over. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
If you're just looking for a fee, you're prioritizing how much it costs. You're not prioritizing what you're getting, because you don't have a true understanding of what you could be missing by not paying more, right? Or not even necessarily more, by paying what I think is a reasonable fee for the services that I offer. So consulting with an attorney from the beginning, so that we have an attorney on retainer, so to speak.
Yes.
And then you could ask a million questions, right? You shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. And the time frame to do so is before you actually make an offer on their house. So for buyers and sellers, that would be the number one piece of advice. Is, I realize it sounds self-serving, but it actually makes my job way easier, because then once they have an accepted offer, we can then start going with actually what we need to do.
That makes sense.
There's no education at that
So the
point.
buyer should, or the seller should reach you weeks in advance and have a consultation with you
Right when you start the process.
and a commitment to you.
Yeah.
So then, like you said, as they're going through the buyer selling process,
Yeah, I mean,
I think,
I know you guys love my analogies for now. So what I tell clients is, again, If you're looking for a house and it takes you 9 months, it's the same time frame, let's say, to have a kid. I'm not just walking into the delivery room with my wife, who has no relationship with any of these doctors and medical professionals, and saying, all right, who's the cheapest and who's available right now? Right? Is that the type of like relationship? And I'm sure accountants could attest to this as well. It's like you get a call at April 15th at 11:59 p.m. like, hey, I need a tax return filed now. It's like, where have you been this entire time? Where from the second I thought I needed this to the second where it's actually happening? Because to Peter's point, it happens quick and it's expected to happen quick. Yeah. And if you're not as quick, then everyone fills in the void of time with worst case scenario because they try to rationalize it from their own mentality. What would be the reason why this is taking so long?
Sure.
Let alone the context of why it's taking so long is lost on the seller because it's actually their attorney who didn't send the contract out. So there's a tempering of expectations proactively that we can go over with our clients. That way they just have to focus on finding a house. You have to focus on finding a house and an attorney. Right, so that would be my number one piece of advice.
Yeah, so you want your team assembled right prior to even going out and doing what you need
gives you
to
that
do.
confidence, and just calling a spade. If you see, like we said before with Mad Libs, is that if it's Musso team and Diamond Law, and you submit that offer with your referred lender, and they see that they're like, oh, this is a known quantity. This is a brand that I trust, as opposed to who's your attorney. It's like, you don't even know who your attorney is? Like, why you made an offer in a home? You don't even have an attorney yet?
Right.
Like, that seems like if I was an agent, I'd be like, what are you doing here? Do you even have a lender?
It's a real thing.
It is a real thing.
When we submit offers in, we make sure attorney's information's on there, lender's information, everything is packaged up. And I can't tell you how many deals that we get pushed through because they know when we put an offer through, we're going to close and we're going to get everything done quickly.
Yeah, especially if this attorney's in court all day and needs to get back to you tomorrow.
Right.
Meanwhile, they want you to sign the contract today because it's Friday.
Yeah.
Because you have your open house tomorrow, and the buyer wants you to cancel the open house. You're like, who's your attorney? They're like, oh, they're going to call me back today. Like, this is not already set up, so not a good look.
I do have one last question for you, because I know it's not typical, but have you done it? So, you may have done it. So if we're repping a buyer, no, you can't go that way. If we rep the seller, you might have to cut this. I'm just thinking in a way.
Legal advice.
Is this an envelope of cash under the table, Paul? What's happening?
I'm just thinking like if you're in a situation where you get the contracts out yourself. Like if you're repping the buyer on a deal.
And the seller's attorney's taking forever.
So if you can go with this. If you're repping the buyer on a deal.
Yeah.
So have you ever repped the buyer on a deal, right? And the attorney for the seller is not around, is in court and says, Mr. Klein, can you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Can you get that typical contract to sale out for me because I'm jammed for a couple of days? Have you ever been in that situation?
Yeah, sure. So the answer is yes. So the funny thing is I view experience as time multiplied by volume, right? So you'll see attorneys, and I heard this a lot younger in my career, where it's like, I've been doing this, for 20 years. I'm like, wrong. Just because you've been doing it for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that you do specifically this. Plus things evolve, right? When I first started, it was facsimile, right? And that was people used to say, I don't use my fax machine. I don't check my email. It's something people still say today.
Right.
And that's a pretty popular way to communicate.
Right.
Yeah. So through experience, there's things that I have gone through once in 25 years. And that's one of them. Where not necessarily the attorney asked me to, okay? That would have been nice. That would have been professional, and I certainly would, and I'd have so much respect. In fact, I can tell, my interns can tell, after a full summer, that when the attorney arrives in the closing, they just don't know what they're doing. Because there's a certain process to do everything, right? Again, restaurant analogy, if you bring out dessert first, and you've been in a restaurant before, you know this isn't right. Right? But this is the way some people inefficiently are like, why are you doing this first? Like, this should be done last. In any event, to finally answer your question, I've had clients suggested, because they're just taking too long and they don't want to lose the deal. So I can draft the contract as I see to be reasonable and send it over to them signed, but that's interpreted as extremely insulting for the other side. But again, clients, there's a certain box of expectation, and I fill that box before they even knew that it existed. And what most clients try to do is control the situation. And they try to brainstorm. It keeps them up at night. Like, what could I do to do this? And like, well, if I need to sign the contract, I don't have a contract, brainstorm, I'll create my own contract and send it to them. Is that something that I feel is a good idea? To get it done, it's better than doing nothing, right?
Right.
People have a busy energy, so
Yeah.
they feel like they have to do something. But in that instance, it's a total loss and breakdown of communication because clients can have the worst attorney that if you Google their name for the reviews, they have 200 reviews that all average out to 1 out of 5. And then if you read, because if you click on the reviews, there's the hot words that get used most frequently.
Right.
It says 0. And you're like, what does 0 mean? And you click on 0. You know what 0 means? It says that everyone who gave them a 1 star wish they could have given them a 0.
Oh my gosh.
Okay? That's what it means. So these attorneys, when a seller or a client retains them and then they end up sucking, you know whose fault that is? It's actually not the attorney's fault. Okay? It's the client's fault for retaining their services and allowing it to happen and continue to happen, right? If you're not happy with your chosen professional, you can leave at any time, right? Just tell them him or her how it is, and that you're going in a different direction, and it is what it is, right? So if you are the client and you're surrounding yourself with losers, and you lose the deal because of it, and everything's just stressed out, that's a you problem, because you were the one who selected it at the end of the day. And I hear that from clients on the other side. We're like, oh, we can't get a mortgage. I'm like, well, how? Why? I'm like, oh, the credit score is too low. I'm like, your credit score, I could do and hold my breath on my phone right now, right? This is not like trigonometry, right? And meanwhile, we're in the transaction.
Wow.
And the attorney's like, well, it's their lender's fault. I'm like, yeah, you selected the lender though. Vicariously, it's your fault. It's your money. You put your money in their hands, and they let you down. Not good. So to answer your question. Have I had it happen? Yes. Would I suggest it as anything that anyone else should repeat in the future? Definitely not. I think that in this instance, I would have spoken with the listing agent to say, speak with your seller because we want to sign this contract and their attorney's not getting back to us. And I could predict that I wouldn't be able to reach the listing agent either in this instance. And you have to tell your client that sometimes the journey to purchasing a home is more difficult than it needs to be, and you need to prioritize, okay? This is a pros cons list.
Okay.
The pro is you love and need the home. If you don't want to wait for it, you don't love and need the home. That's the way it goes.
Yep.
Okay. So if it reaches a breaking point where you can't wait anymore, the relationship's off. Go look for something else.
Right.
Because you can't call me every day and email every day, frustrated, nothing's happening, and demand answers. The reality of it is you're gonna have to sit there and be patient. And if and when it happens, it'll be worth it at the end. And if not, keep looking, right? You ask somebody to prom, they didn't get back to you. Prom's approaching, you gotta find somebody else, and that's it, right? And I'm sure you have a good time with them.
Yeah.
That's the way it goes, you know?
Right.
Rich, it's been great, man. Thank you so much for spending the time with us here. And I think our followers will benefit from the conversation we've had here today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I kind of view this like therapy. I can get everything off my chest to help everyone else out.
Well, it's nice for us to sit down and reconnect like this too.
Yeah, for sure.
We're always running so hard, we don't get time to chit chat.
Yeah.
It's great
Definitely.
meeting you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
You got it,
Appreciate
guys.
I hope everybody learned a little something today. Thank you.